Hey everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today we will be starting a new series called Viridian. The creator of this What If is Silver Mist anime lover or known as KR Stark Tower. If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe and share the video with your friends. Now on to the What If. Chapter 1, Farewell, You Have to Go. The older man shouted urgently, shooting a fierce glare towards his companion. If I leave you, you'll die. The younger argued, green eyes brimming with tears. You know as well as I do, that we don't have a choice, here. We always knew one of us would have to stay behind to destroy the portal. So why should I be the one to go? You're the teacher. The hero. What good could someone like me do? Izuku. The man's voice was harsh, and his sharp tone made the younger man's eyes focus on his friend. The elder's eyes softened. It must be you. You're not who you were back then. You aren't useless. Remember this, you are a hero. And the world is counting on you even if nobody realizes it. But Izuku sniffled. What about you? I swore. I promised I'd look after you. Here. When the time comes, give this to him. You'll know he trusts you when he calls you problem child. He smiled fondly, handing Izuku a pair of rings on a chain. Deranged laughter filtered down the corridor, making the two stiffen. They hadn't expected him to show up. With that man in the building, they knew their defenses wouldn't hold for much longer. You need to go, now. He pulled Izuku into a hug, as the smaller man clung to him for all he was worth, tears streaming down his face. This isn't goodbye. Yes it is. Izuku's fingers dug into the man's shoulder. You won't be, you. That's ridiculous. I'll always be me. And you'll always be my problem child. The man then violently shoved Izuku backwards, making him stumble into the swirling vortex. Save the world, Midori ya Izuku. He smiled, a bright hopeful grin that looked so out of place on the man's exhausted face. The door behind him disintegrated into dust as a blue-haired man covered in severed hands grinned in glee, only to screech in rage upon seeing Izuku in the portal. With an indomitable fury, his hand latched onto the older man's face, covering his eyes so he couldn't escape his fate. Shouta. With a smirk, Shouta clicked the big red button. The last thing Izuku heard, before being entirely consumed by the portal, was the gateway exploding. Pain. Pain was all that Izuku knew. It felt like his atoms were being torn apart and thrust back together. The first thing he was aware of, as the pain started to fade, was that it was unusually bright outside. And someone was there. He tried to fall into a defensive crouch, but his body wouldn't obey. Instead he found himself on his butt as he blinked up at All Might. I cannot simply say you can become a hero even without power. Oh. This was that day on the rooftop. Of course I had to go back to one of the worst moments of my life. Of fucking course. He only looked back up when the iron door closed behind the blonde figure. Izuku winced as he staggered to his feet. He looked down at his younger hands. They were smaller than he was used to, but there was still that scar he'd gotten when he was 23 after he stupidly participated in a drunken round of the knife game. Wait a minute. He winced when his voice came out several octaves higher than he was used to, but ignored that for the moment. He instead looked himself over. Carefully peeling off his shirt, he looked down to find a familiar, yet vastly different body. His muscle was still there, as were all his scars. He could count his ribs, and his skin was shockingly pale. That slash he'd gotten from Inomo 2 weeks ago was still there and healing, but his body was also so much smaller. I'm 14 again. They had no idea how things would pan out. For all their calculations and carefully run scenarios, Izuku and Shouta had no real way of knowing if this would even work. For all they knew, he'd be tossed back a few months or even to the womb. Or just killed. Shouta. Izuku breathed as the gravity of what had just happened hit him hard. He fell back against the wall behind him and brought his face to his knees. With no one there to witness anything, he freely cried for the first time since Sushi's death. He was truly alone for the first time in years, and it wasn't a good feeling. He felt isolated and lost and he needed Shouta's strong reassuring arms around him. He needed his best friend, his brother. And the realization that Shouta and Hisashi were still alive now didn't help any because they wouldn't remember him. He would be a stranger to them, and that just hurt him all the more. Damn it, Shao. He sniffled. Voice cracking. I swear to God I'm going to make your life a living hell for pulling that kind of stunt. He aggressively swiped away his tears. We were supposed to do this together, you asshole. He looked down at the necklace clenched in his fist. Hisashi and Shouta's wedding bands sat innocently in his palm. With a shaky sigh, he put the necklace around his own neck and tucked it into his shirt, which he put back on. Wait. He looked down at his clothing. It was exactly what he'd been wearing in the lab that he and Shouta had occupied. How had All Might not? Time travel is so goddamned confusing. He shook his head. He patted himself down, smirking lightly as he realized he had all his weapons on his person. Cool. So I've got 10 months until the entrance exams. He nodded to himself. He looked over the railing to the bustling city below him. He felt like his senses were on overdrive. He'd survived about 8 to 10 years in the deathly silence of a post-apocalyptic world where the slightest sound could very well get you killed. So a lively town filled with colorful noise and movement made him twitchy as hell, and set all his senses to high alert as he awaited the arrival of an enemy that he knew wasn't going to come. As if I wasn't socially awkward enough before. He shook his head. Izuku had no intentions of going back home. His dear mother had never taken kindly to his quirklessness. She had been a kind and loving woman once, but his father had come home when he was about 5 and slowly poisoned her mind. So even though his father was off on long business trips and never home, his mother had dished out plenty of neglect more often than not. She wasn't outright abusive, but she could care less if he was even there or not. With that thought in mind, he carefully leapt from one rooftop to another, avoiding the more populated areas as he made his way back to his mother's apartment. He was honestly surprised he remembered where it was, let alone which window was his. It'd been long enough that he'd hardly remembered the apartment number. The only way he recognized the room was because of that crack on the window from when he'd gotten met at age 7 and threw something at it. Izuku stole into his old bedroom, taking a moment to reminisce about his old childish room. The walls were covered in drawings of hero posters that he'd never been allowed to buy. He'd gotten much better at drawing them over the years, and the shelves were covered in replicas of hero merch that he'd eyed in the stores. The older ones he'd made from stolen Play-Doh at school, while the newer ones were made of actual clay he'd snitched from some pottery places around town, the scraps, that is. He smiled softly before grabbing a backpack and stuffing it with clothes, provisions, and blankets. He carefully took the 3 Eraserhead figurines, 5 Present Mike figurines, and 1 Midnight figurine. He grabbed his analysis notebooks and a fair supply of pencils, clay, and paints before sneaking into his mother's room and snagging some money. With that done, he grabbed one picture, taken on his 3rd birthday, before everything went to shit, and fled out the window. There was only one place he could think of that he could stay without having to answer any unnecessary questions or interact with people: Dagobah Beach. He couldn't help but grin as he came upon the heaping mountains of trash. Nobody would bother him here. That's for sure. He dug his way through the trash before finding an old abandoned camper. He'd need to clean it out, but it'd be perfect. He grinned as he went inside. It smelled terrible, but he'd lived in worse. At least he'd be warm. Being a kid again, Izuku decided, was weird. Gone was his stubble and deep voice, and back was that awkward higher-pitched squeaky voice he'd been stuck with until he'd hit 16 or so. It'd been about 2 weeks since his return, and Izuku was finally settled. He'd cleaned out the camper and scrubbed every inch of it with bleach he'd bought from the local dollar store. Beggars can't be choosers, but he was going to minimize as many health risks as he could. By the time he was done, the place was practically sparkling. He'd fixed the moldy, leaky roof, too. The engine was shot to hell, but that was fine by him. He wasn't planning on going anywhere, anyways. But he was also getting restless. He'd had a backpack that had come back with him from the future that had plenty of supplies and plans that he and Shouta had worked on together, and sometimes just seeing Shouta's handwriting made him tear up. But his old vigilante outfit was in there, too. And it got him thinking. In the years before Shigaraki destroyed the world, Midoriya Izuku had been a vigilante known as Viridian. He'd tried to find a solid career as a quirkless nobody. He'd ended up eventually trying his hand at support items, but even helping heroes didn't satisfy his deep-seated need to help people. And back then, There'd been a lot more people that needed help than the heroes could reach, so Izuku had taken it upon himself to answer those quiet cries for help. He smiled softly as he held the dark green jumpsuit. The mask looked more like an old-school ninja's, leaving his green eyes open for the world to see. He held it up in front of him and frowned. Of course, the outfit was made with his adult self in mind. So his tiny prepubescent self was not going to fit into that outfit. Okay. Time for Plan B. Plan B was to go by the local discount store and buy a Halloween costume and then modify it to look as close to his vigilante outfit as possible. The end result was a black jumpsuit with multiple hidden pouches, as well as a bunch of pouches that resembled a utility belt, that looked reminiscent of a ninja. It wasn't as durable as he would have liked, and it wasn't anything resistant, but it'd have to do. He pulled up the head mask, which left only the slit for his eyes, and attached his weapons to his person. He looked in the cracked mirror he'd salvaged from the dump. He looked like a good old-fashioned ninja, like an actual shadow person. He was kind of cool, if he did say so himself. He tightened his bootlaces, 5-finger discounted from the mall, and triple-checked his mask. He was finally ready to go. Izuku sighed as he readied himself to go out on his patrol. It'd been about 2 months since he started doing these again, and it was dreadfully easy. He'd had no idea how uncommon vigilantes were before the League of Villains attack on USJ. In fact, there were only a handful in Japan, who lasted more than a week. Even though he was still dreadfully malnourished from his time in the future, he rarely had any trouble bringing down criminals. They just weren't anywhere near the same caliber as the Nomu he was used to facing. Because of this, he was starting to make a name for himself. The internet, in particular, was starting to whisper about a new vigilante who was protecting civilians in the harsher, less patrolled areas that heroes seemed to forget. Places like South Musutafu, where the unwanted of society seemed to end up. He'd learned from the misfortune of others that if he didn't come up with a name for himself, that the police and internet would come up with one for him. And they didn't always come up with the best of names. So Izuku decided, since he was also kind of shit at names, to stick with the one he'd had in his previous timeline, Viridian. He smirked as he tied up a group of drug traders, who were glaring at him. He chuckled. The new voice modifier made his voice sound deeper and older. It sounded like his future self, which honestly put Izuku more at ease. Do me a favor, would ya? He grinned beneath his mask as he looked at the 3 men. Let the cops know that Viridian says hi. With that, he nimbly scaled the side of the building, finding handholds and footholds where most people would find none. Within minutes, the police were on the scene, responding to the phone call of the frightened civilian he'd saved. A man with a familiar tan trench coat stepped out of one of the vehicles. Viridian grinned. So they've finally brought Tsukashi on. This'll be interesting. He knew of the detective from his original vigilante career. He was a good man and a fantastic detective. Viridian was going to have fun with him. All right, detective. Viridian muttered to himself. Let the games begin. I have no name, dude. Have you heard of that new vigilante in Musutafu? The Keikai's a lie, Viridian, right? He's all over the chat rooms. Nobody can stop talking about the guy. Dragonina dress, I think he's just a rumor. Nobody's seen him but the people he's supposedly caught, after all. Moldy Brochkli, I saw him. I swear. He totally saved me the other night. These guys were about to attack me, and he just hops down from the rooftop like a badass and saves me. He looks like a ninja but has green eyes. Noiskerdili, you serious? The Keikai's a lie. I'm glad you're okay. Did you get a picture? Dragonina dress, I still don't think he's real. Moldy Brochkli, I got a grainy shot. It was dark. Gimme a sec, I'm new to this site. Noiskerdili, upper left of your chat box, click the dots. Should have an option for an attachment. Moldy Brochkli, thanks Moldy Brochkli, savior.jpg demonic gay microwave, holy shit he's real. Dragonina dress, millimeter. Could be photoshopped. Barbie I saw her, just admit her wrong, SMH. Moldy Brochkli, at any rate I owe Viridian my life. He's got a new fan in me, for sure. Hashtag Viridian, hashtag heroes, hashtag vigilante. Hashtag Viridianth Hero Chapter 2, Fun and Games. Viridian grinned. He was having a blast. It had been nearly 4 months since he'd become a vigilante again, and the lower crime rates of this time allowed him more time to mess with his favorite detective. They'd already brought the heroes on board, as was protocol when a vigilante ran rampant for too long. He enjoyed his little game of hide-and-seek if you will. If he was stuck as a kid again, he was going to enjoy every minute of it. So far, nobody but the villains he left for Tsukachi had seen him, and he now held a reputation as one of Japan's most elusive vigilantes to date, something he was rather proud of. Tonight, he was playing a game with Tsukachi and the hero that the detective had invited along midnight. Viridian would admit it was hard to see her again. She'd been like family to him in his original timeline, and knowing that she wouldn't even recognize him now made his heart constrict painfully. It was part of the reason why he was playing this game tonight. If he couldn't even handle seeing Nemuri again, how on earth would he handle seeing Hisashi or Shouta? And he had no doubts that Eraserhead would soon be brought onto his case. The man was well known for his ways with vigilantes. Viridian had been leaving notes with each criminal he'd captured tonight. Each one had some sort of puzzle or code that Tsukachi had to crack, which would lead him to the next clue, or villain. Izuku had spent the last week and a half making them all, so he was greatly enjoying the chaos that was unfolding. Especially when Tsukachi found one clue taped under his desk. How the hell did he get in here? Tsukachi growled, rifling through the security footage, which had since been edited. Looks like Viridian is pretty tech-savvy. Midnight tapped her chin as she looked around the office. I have little doubt he can hear us right now. Tsukachi growled as his phone pinged. Viridian chaos, sure can Tsukachi-kun. How did you? You know what? I'm not even going to ask. He shook his head as Midnight came over to look over his shoulder. Huh. So this guy's got us bugged, too. She looked herself over. Viridian chaos, don't bother with it right now, Kayama-chan. I'll deactivate the bugs as soon as tonight's game is done. No worries. How the hell does this guy know my name? Midnight growled, eyes scouring the room. As if she could find the vigilante hiding under a chair. That's just how he is. Tsukachi sighed, placing a calming hand on her shoulder. Don't take it too personally. He's got information on just about everyone that we have no idea how he got a hold of. Now come on, this clue has coordinates to follow. With that, the two sped off towards the coordinates. Viridian laughed as he followed them. Along the rooftops. He'd been at this game since early that evening around 6 p.m. and it was now nearly 12 a.m. He'd kept the two far past their shifts, but it was for a very good reason. Because while they were busy following his breadcrumbs and rounding up the criminals he'd captured, Viridian was busting open a very large and highly dangerous drug ring, one that he didn't want to let the detective participate in due to the volatile nature of the drugs they were handling. To someone with a quirk, getting hit by these drugs could be devastating, as their effects were known to permanently damage someone's quirk factor, sometimes completely destroying it altogether. But to Viridian, who had no quirk factor, it was as harmless as saline. And the faces on the gang leaders when they shot him with the drug and he just brushed it off was priceless. How? That should have destroyed your quirk. The man cried out, terrified, as he backed away. Even if it takes a bit to activate, it should at least cause you debilitating pain. His men were already unconscious around him, and the man he'd been trading with watched with an interested gaze. So you're the new vigilante on the block? Viridian. Yes. The man had dark brown hair and a mask that reminded Viridian of an old witch doctor. Yes. And you are Chisaki Kai, better known as Overhaul. Your information network is as impressive as they say. You're one elusive man, you know. Was that a compliment? Could be. Overhaul pulled out what looked to be a business card. If you ever find yourself in need of comrades, I can make you. Great. I appreciate the offer, Chisaki-san, but I'm afraid that I work for myself. He answered carefully as he casually knocked the whimpering drug trader out, turning his entire focus towards the Yakuza boss. I had a feeling you'd say that. So what do you say to a mutual partnership? Viridian could hear the grin in Chisaki's voice as he spoke. I'll leave you to think on that. Contact me if you change your mind. He let out a breath of relief when the masked man left. He knew Overhaul was one of the worst kinds of villains one could encounter. He wasn't stupid enough to pick a fight with him right off the get-go, especially when he had no backup. He vaguely remembered hearing about the man torturing children, and keeping one girl who was rumored to be his daughter captive. He clenched his fist. "I'm sorry, little girl. You're going to have to wait a little while longer, okay? I can't get to you, yet." He mentally apologized. Viridian shook his head and rounded up the villains in the warehouse before tying them all up and getting the final prize ready. Tsukachi and Midnight were going to hate him so much for this, but their reactions would be hilarious. Tsukachi Naomasa was not happy. He'd been sent on a wild fucking goose chase with Midnight for nearly 6 hours straight. He was tired, and that stupid vigilante Viridian had been mocking them all night long. At one point, the bastard had even led them to Tsukachi's favorite cafe. And upon walking in, the barista had held out his and Midnight's favorite drinks, claiming that someone had come in earlier to pay for them. He'd even specified the time for pickup. And of course, there was no physical description or video on the security cameras to tell them anything they didn't already know. The detective was far beyond done, and his hero companion for the night looked frazzled and high-strung, too. He had half a mind to just call it quits and give up on Viridian for the evening, when they finally discovered the last clue. Or what Naomasa prayed was the last clue. "Viridian Chaos, I see you've made it to the final clue. Just in time, detective. Come find your treasure." Error. He shook his head as he read the text. This guy was so childish. The location in question was an old warehouse. He could smell the gunpowder from outside, meaning that something had gone down here recently. He signaled for his team and Midnight to be on high alert, as they rushed into the warehouse. "Freeze. Police." He paused as he stared at a large group of men tied up and suspended from the rafters. They were making muffled protests through their gags, as a spotlight, of all things, illuminated a large old-fashioned treasure chest like what you'd see in pirate movies. It looked big enough for a grown man to climb into. Was this a sneak attack? No, Viridian was clever. He wouldn't allow himself to stay in such a restricted and obvious location. So who or what was inside? Tsukachi gave a long-suffering sigh as he ordered his men to round up the villains and approached the chest cautiously. Midnight gave him a subtle nod and they opened it together. Inside were thousands of golden coins. They're chocolate. Midnight realized. Tsukachi would not be proud of his momentary lapse in self-control as he screamed out in frustration and anger. "Viridian!" They heard laughter echo around the warehouse and everyone stiffened. The vigilante was still here. "I see you've found your treasure, detective." The voice was low, and he'd placed the man somewhere around late 20s to early 30s. "Come out now, Viridian. We've got the place surrounded. You've nowhere to run. That's what you think. Now, let me just clarify something before you come after me with guns blazing." The man sounded more amused than anything else, and no matter how hard Tsukachi looked, he couldn't see any sign of the man that was speaking. "Those men down there? They came here earlier tonight for a drug trade." Viridian continued. "It's actually why I kept you occupied all night. Can't have any of you in the line of fire for this, after all." From the shadows of the rafters, a single briefcase fell to the floor. One trigger-happy cop fired at where the case had fallen from, and a pained grunt followed. "Ow. Jerk. Hold your fire," Tsukachi ordered. "We don't want him dead." "So nice to know you care, Tsukachi." Viridian chuckled as a few drops of blood fell onto the briefcase. "Evidence. We can run the blood through the system to figure out who he is." Tsukachi quickly gathered what he could. All the while, the vigilante chuckled. "Gather whatever you want, it'll bring you nowhere. I promise you, detective, you won't find me that way, but and for effort. You said you wanted to keep us away from here. Why?" Midnight pressed. "Because of what's in that briefcase. I may be a vigilante, but I love heroes. You guys are my idols, even if I couldn't become one, myself." Tsukachi heard the truth in that. If you were hit by one of those, it would have ended your career. "What is it?" Tsukachi asked, eyeing the bluish substance in the tubes. "A drug that severely damages and in some cases completely destroys your quirk factor." The room stopped breathing. "As far as I know, these are the only ones in existence right now. And they take a good hour to do any permanent damage. If you work fast, you can find a way to counteract it. Just in case I missed some." You ran us around the city so there'd be no risk of someone getting hit with this? Midnight asked. Yep. And it was any less dangerous for you, because... I'm not revealing all my secrets, Detective. Let's just say that I've got defenses against that none of you have. He's telling the truth. Tsukachi ground out. As much as he hated to admit it, this guy was really looking out for them tonight. He was honestly trying to protect them. Well, as much as I'd love to stay and chat, I've got to get this lovely gunshot wound your man gave me treated before it gets much worse. So I'll see you later, and since we've finally met in person, I'll just call you Naomasa, K. No, you cannot call me by my given name. Tsukachi growled, but there was no response. That night, Viridian escaped, and none of them could figure out how. They'd found a blood-soaked beam in the rafters where he'd been shot, and presumably where he'd been talking from, but the blood trail ended pretty quickly. Nobody was admitted to a hospital with a gunshot wound that night or within the next few days that matched what little description they had, and though he wouldn't admit it, Tsukachi was actually a little relieved when the vigilante showed up on patrol again 3 days later. He wasn't about to forgive him for that hellish night of treasure hunting, but he realized that this guy was closer to a hero than a villain. Perhaps it was finally time to call an Eraserhead. Moldy Brochkli, guys. Have you heard? Viridian's on the list. Demonic Gay Microwave, list? The Haveno name, they mean the vigilante list. Basically, it means that Viridian is now a legally recognized vigilante. Moldy Brochkli, yeah. It's so cool. Barbie I saw her house. That cool? I thought you liked him. Moldy Brochkli, it's cool B/C, it means that he's doing good. Noiskerdili, right, because he's capturing a lot of villains, he's making them look bad, so they want to catch him sooner. He's climbing the vigilante ranks pretty fast, actually. Notably good at hiding himself, he hasn't been spotted yet. The Keikai's a lie, that's neat. Hey, sorry to change the topic, but have any of you got the new Animal Crossing? The Haveno name, yeah. It's so cool. Chapter 3, Eraserhead Izuku sighed as he casually strolled through the back alleyways leading to Dagaba. He'd already gotten into a few smaller fistfights with the local homeless thugs who'd been trying to sleep on his beach. He'd been homeless enough times in the first run how he'd started referring to his original timeline that he understood the importance of protecting your territory. If he just let any old homeless beggar sleep on his beach, then he'd find himself dead fairly quickly. Or they'd take his stuff, which could lead him to death. Either way, there wasn't much trust amongst the homeless. He couldn't afford to be nice. Especially when any little injury had a fairly high risk of getting infected and putting him out of commission. That was something he could not afford. He had to get into no ands ifs or buts. His unwanted neighbors, those who slept in the alleyways and parks surrounding the beach, were learning fairly quickly not to mess with the seemingly defenseless child. And after last week's incident where he coolly stared down a beggar with a gun, well, let's just say that he was not only earning their respect but their fear, too. He didn't mind so long as they left him alone. He was now officially out of money, though. He'd made it last as long as he could. But it wasn't like he had any income. He'd gotten lucky with those chocolate coins in the treasure hunting gig he pulled, but what else was he supposed to do after winning a year's supply of chocolate coins? He sure as hell couldn't eat all that. Besides, the recording of Naomasa losing his shit was priceless and still made him chuckle. One day, he and the detective would look back on that video and laugh. Probably. But his most pressing issue now was food. He was able to shower at the local gym. The locks were dreadfully easy to pick and he'd 5-finger discounted all the hygiene items he'd needed. He did the same with light snacks and the like, but he felt bad stealing like that. Water was easy enough to come by. The parks had plenty of water fountains that he could rehydrate at. Plus, the dented hydro flask he'd found in his dump was perfect after he'd bleached it out. Seriously, the previous owner had somehow grown mold and decided to toss it thereafter. It just needed a good soak in bleach and hot water. People were so lazy these days. Oh well, more for him. But he couldn't keep stealing loaves of bread like some discount Aladdin. He needed to actually find a way to buy food. Actual groceries and stuff. He couldn't survive off bread and jerky forever. Especially since he was still recovering from his near starvation in the apocalypse, and all his vigilante activities. He couldn't get a job, though. He had to be at least 15 to work at any real establishment, and even then he had to have his school's permission. No way Aldera would grant him that. Never mind the fact that he was quirkless, he'd have to pay them to hire him. So getting a job was out. He briefly considered Chisaki, but quickly shuddered. No. Hell no. He'd worked under the guy once, and swore to never make the same mistake again. So where did that leave him? Food from the shelters? No, too many questions. Homeless adults were one thing, but a homeless kid with no parental supervision? He'd get CPS called on his ass faster than he could outrun Tsukachi. And Izuku did not want to get chucked into the system or be sent back to his mother. Besides, the food banks required you to register yourself, which included a quirk, something that would instantly disqualify him, as he'd learned from experience. Fucking quirkless discrimination. Welp, what do ya think, Shao? He turned to look at an old photo he'd found at the bottom of his bag. It'd been taken within the first few years of the apocalypse. Shouta stood, a hand on Izuku's shoulder as Hisashi had an arm flung around the both of them. Nemuri stood on Izuku's other side, ruffling his hair. Power Loader stood in the background, smiling fondly beside Dabi and Tamaki. Good time, he missed his family. Tears pricked the edges of his eye as he looked away. I know. I'm being stupid. He chuckled humorlessly to himself. I dunno, guys, maybe it's the hunger talking? At any rate, I'm open to suggestions. Silence. He scuffed his foot against the carpet of the camper. It was too quiet. He couldn't take the quiet any longer. Abruptly, he stood. Okay. He clapped his hands. Since the food issue is too much for me right now, let's just, do something else. He glanced out the window where the late afternoon sun shone through. It's too early for patrol. He pouted. Beeryut. He reached over and pulled out the laptop he'd salvaged from the dump. Well, salvaged was a bit of a stretch, considering the fact that he'd practically built the damn thing from scratch. He booted it up. He grinned as he played some music. Let's get hacking, then. Viridian had just finished tying up some unsavory thugs. One man glared at him, and he chuckled. This guy's glare had nothing on Shigaraki. He'd never really been concerned about villains seeing him. Or heroes or cops, for that matter. It was more of a game, really. He wanted to see how long he could go before they sighted him. So far, it'd been 4 months, and no hero or cop had actually laid eyes on him. So you're that fucking Viridian guy? Yep. He smirked. You're shitting me. You're Japan's most elusive vigilante. Another guy scoffed. Oh, so I'm the most elusive now? I got an upgrade. He grinned, waiting for the telltale sound of sirens in the distance. He paused, sensing something else. Quick as a shadow and quiet as snow, he ducked out of the sights of the villains as he scaled the side of the alleyway before perching atop the roof. Not a moment later a very familiar figure entered the alleyway. Shouta. He blinked back tears, ducking behind the ledge so as not to be seen. Viridian ducked behind the edge of the alleyway just as a man rounded the corner. He had a strange scarf wrapped around his neck that seemed to hide something yellow, and was dressed in black. The messy unkempt hair and perpetually exhausted look lead him to believe that this was the hero Eraserhead, famous among vigilantes. The man was rumored to be sharp and quick, so he had to get out of there before he who's there. Eraserhead demanded as he immediately ran towards Viridian's hiding spot. Shit. Viridian quickly climbed the fire escape just as the man found him. He felt something wrap around his left ankle and yank him down to street level. Ah, come on. That's cheating. I thought you had a normal scarf. Viridian complained. He didn't care that it made him look childish. He'd had a very long night. Before he had much more time to complain, the man had him wrapped tightly and securely in the bindings. Who are you? Viridian. So you're that vigilante? Huh. You're shorter than I expected. Well, excuse me for growing up neglected and half-starved. Not my fault, my growth was stunted. I'm going to have to take you back to the station. For what? I haven't broken any laws. Viridian huffed. He tried to cross his arms, but the scarf was too tight, so he settled for a pouting look. Nice try, kid, but I'm an adult, I'll have you know. You're a kid to me. Eraserhead glared. Vigilantism is a crime. So I'm placing you under arrest. You have no proof that I used a quirk. Vigilantism is defined as a person who uses their quirk illegally to take down crime. I've got a friend that can help me with that. He yanked on the scarf, making Viridian stumble after him. Now come on, you're wasting my time. I want to sleep tonight, thanks. Viridian was glad not for the first time that he was a paranoid bastard. He waited until Eraserhead turned away to lead him from the alleyway before he grinned. He slipped off the caps he kept on his canines, revealing very sharp fangs. Years ago, he'd asked a good friend who had a transmutation quirk and happened to be a dentist, to file down his teeth into fangs, just the canines, and reinforce them with the strongest metal he could. The guy happened to owe Izuku a favor, so he did so without raising a fuss, though he did charge him a small fortune. Now, Viridian was very grateful for this decision as he silently tore through the bindings with said fangs. Eraserhead looked behind him just in time to see Viridian disappear over the rooftop. He cursed. Viridian shook himself out of his flashback, tongue absently running over the exposed fangs. He figured he should keep them out as Viridian and hide them as Izuku. He hadn't realized how hard this would be. He wanted nothing more than to jump down into that alleyway and hug him. But he doesn't know you. You're nothing but a vigilante to him. He's not Shouta, he's Eraserhead. They aren't the same person, now. He took a deep breath. Luckily, he'd had a few weeks of experience with Nemuri, so this was a lot easier than it would have been without. He shook his head and looked back over the edge, watching as Eraserhead scoured the area for him. Viridian barely dodged out of sight as Eraserhead looked up, and he heard the capture weapon wrapping around the nearby fire escape. Well, Viridian had no intentions of replicating how they met in the original timeline. He wasted no time in making his own escape. He leapt over rooftops with as much grace and practice as the man behind him. Eraserhead was fast, but Viridian had had plenty of practice running across rooftops while trying to outrun dangerous and hungry monsters. Compared to that, this was a leisurely jog. He locked eyes with Eraserhead over his shoulder as he finally shook him off his tail. That made Eraserhead the first person to actually see him. Naomasa was going to flip his shit. But first, he smirked, knowing that Eraserhead would still be looking for him. Now that he'd had a breather to calm down and really process his situation, he found himself giddy. He knew how to get under Aizawa Shouta's skin like nobody else, and he was going to have fun this go around. Okay, so maybe he was a little bitter at how the man had captured him in the original timeline. Viridian Chaos, hello Eraserhead. Nice night we're having. Watson, how the hell did you get this number? Viridian Chaos, I have my ways. Watson changed their name to Eraserhead. Viridian Chaos added Detective Holmes to the chat. Detective Holmes, Viridian. What are you up to now? Eraserhead, you mean he does this a lot? Detective Holmes, more than you know. Viridian Chaos, I just thought you'd be happy to know that Eraserhead here is the first person to officially see me. Detective Holmes, you're shitting me. You really saw him? Eraserhead, yeah. He's shorter than I expected. Viridian Chaos, hey. That's mean. I'll have you. No, my growth was stunted due to a neglectful childhood and malnutrition. Detective Holmes, mind giving us a name? Viridian Chaos, Viridian, winky face. Eraserhead, perhaps something more to go on. Like an age or birth date. Viridian Chaos, how about no? Look, I'm a vigilante, not stupid. I text you guys to mess with you because I'm bored. There are no villains out tonight, so I'm talking with you instead. Viridian Chaos, Eraserhead, I hear your sigh from over here. I left you some coffee 3 rooftops to your left. The bags under your eyes tell me you need it. He watched with a low chuckle as the hero immediately headed to said location only to find a bag of his favorite coffee grounds from his favorite cafe. The hero's head whipped around, startled. He growled when he couldn't find the vigilante. Eraserhead, how the hell did you know my favorite coffee? Detective Holmes, he has his ways. He knows everyone's favorite coffee, snack, sandwich, and donut. I have no idea how he does it, but he does. Eraserhead, I'm going to lose a lot of sleep over you, aren't I? Viridian Chaos, yep. Laughing face. Alright line can hear. Hopen jever yon safety and healthy and that ever yon slovdenis arisif. A specialite hozo fi you in Europe where shit's really hitting the fan. Izuku chuckled as he checked the group chat that he'd created. It had himself, Neo Mesa, and Eraserhead. He'd probably add present Mike eventually. Possibly midnight. The UA entrance exams were steadily creeping up, and Izuku had reluctantly kept attending Aldera Junior High. He could just hack the system and leave UA none the wiser, but he'd heard stories of Nizu's intelligence that was one basket of hornets he did not want to poke. It was easier for him to simply stay in school, patrol at night, and sleep in his refurbished camper whenever he had the chance. It wasn't like the schoolwork was hard, either. But Bakugo was a fucking pain in his ass. It wasn't that the brat was strong or intimidating to him, anymore. But Izuku had once physically defended himself against Bakugo, only for Izuku to nearly be suspended for defending himself. He couldn't risk a mark on his record. He had to get into UA. No matter what. So as much as he hated it, he had to suck it up and take Bakugo's shit. Though he tossed his own verbal remarks right back at the little brat, causing the blonde to blink in angered shock every time, which was rather entertaining. Especially when Izuku tossed in some profanity, when the teachers couldn't hear, of course. It actually made things somewhat interesting for him, as he had to find new and creative ways to outmaneuver Bakugo so he didn't get beat up after school. Besides, Izuku wasn't known for his fighting skills, so that was just another thing to separate Izuku from Viridian. By the 6-month mark, Viridian had been listed as one of the most wanted vigilantes in all of Japan. Not because he was that dangerous, he was, but they didn't need to know that, but because he was just that difficult to catch. And even after 6 months, the only people who he'd let see him were Eraserhead and Neo Mesa. There was once or twice where he'd let his silhouette be spotted on a rooftop, but Neo Mesa and Eraserhead were the only two he'd actually let fully see him in person, aside from the people he'd rescued and villains. He'd done some work in a few other towns, too, deciding to branch out to search for any sign of the League of Villains. Even in Tokyo, which had some of Japan's most prevalent and talented heroes, nobody had really gotten a good look at him, let alone gotten close enough to catch him. But now, he was back in Musudafu. He grinned at the thought of Tsukashi and Eraserhead. They still had no idea that the guy they were chasing was a now 15-year-old middle schooler who didn't even have a quirk. He still left puzzles, riddles, and other games for his favorite detective and hero to solve whenever he had the chance. It ticked them both off, but he could tell he was growing on them. Aizawa Shouta honestly wasn't sure what to make of the newest vigilante, Viridian. The man was more elusive than Smoke, and more annoying than Hisashi, something he wasn't sure was possible until he met Viridian. Somehow, though, the man was growing on him, like a fungus. An unwanted, irritating, disgusting fungus. Even after all these months, they were going on month 6, now, since Viridian started his vigilante career, they knew next to nothing about the man, and it was incredibly frustrating. They'd had a nice break these last few weeks where Viridian had been bothering the heroes and police in other cities, mostly Tokyo and Kyoto. The man was infuriatingly good at slipping away. Not a single hero had gotten close enough to even see him, let alone capture him. That meant that he and Tsukashi were still the only people who'd had the honor of seeing the man in the flesh. He scowled at his phone in his pocket when it quietly vibrated, letting him know that the very irritation he'd been thinking of was also thinking of him. Wonderful. Viridian Chaos, Eraser. What's up? Eraserhead, Viridian. Viridian Chaos, you're no fun. Detective Holmes, any reason you two decided to distract me from my paperwork with this? Eraserhead, you could just silence the chat. Detective Holmes. Viridian Chaos, oh, this is rich. You don't know how. Ha 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 ha. You're such an old man. Winky face. Shouta had to admit, the fact that the detective didn't know how to silence the chat was kind of funny. Though he'd never tell Viridian that. Ever. Eraserhead, was there a reason why you contacted me? Viridian Chaos, oh yeah. Wanted to let you know I'm back in town. Smiley face. Eraserhead, damn. Here I thought I'd have a longer vacation. Viridian Chaos, you know you love me, Eraserhead, love? I think you misspelled loathe. Viridian Chaos, tongue sticking out, don't be a grouch, you tsundere. By the by, you've got that drug bust tonight, right? Detective Holmes, I don't know why I even question how you know so much anymore. Yes, Eraserhead and I have a drug bust tonight. Why? Viridian Chaos, don't go. It's a setup. They know you're coming, you'll get hurt. Eraserhead stared at the phone for a full minute. This was not what he was expecting. Eraserhead, do you have any evidence to back up your claim? Viridian Chaos, nothing physical. I overheard a few things, and now I'm seriously worried about you guys. Detective Holmes, that's cute, but we've got jobs to do. Viridian Chaos, I mean it, Nea Mesa. Don't go. You too, Shouta. Eraserhead stiffened at his given name. How the hell had this guy gotten his civilian name? Eraserhead, I did not give you permission to call me by my name. Viridian Chaos. Sorry, Izawa. Is that better? Eraserhead, no. Viridian Chaos, too bad. Tongue sticking out, either way, don't go. Eraserhead, sorry, but we've got a drug ring to bust. Viridian Chaos, Eraserhead. Viridian Chaos, Izawa? Viridian Chaos, Shouta? Damn it, Shao, you'd better make it out of there alive. You too, Nea Mesa. Shouta would admit that he was a bit bothered by the way this man was using their given names so freely, but he didn't have much time to worry. They both needed to be at the top of their game for the bust tonight. 20 minutes into said bust, and he was cursing himself for not listening to Viridian. Here he was, Tsukachi at his side, held at gunpoint, and quirk point, by 20 armed men. He'd been right, it was a trap. A trap set up to capture a hero and take out as many cops as they could. Nearly all the men Tsukachi had brought with him were dead or too injured to do anything. Shouta's capture weapon was confiscated, as were his knives and the detective's gun. They were defenseless, and Shouta was cursing himself internally. He didn't see how this situation could get much worse. An interesting little catch we've made. The man grinned as he looked at the hero-detective duo that was tied up to a nearby support pillar in the warehouse. The man then turned to some of his men, barking at them to watch their prisoners before gathering the drugs they'd originally come to take. Shouta glared at the man, but didn't activate his quirk. Erasing this man's quirk wouldn't help him or Tsukachi get out of their literal bind. If anything, they'd just blindfold him and then he'd be completely useless. Any ideas how to get us out of this, Eraser? Tsukachi whispered through bloodied teeth. Shouta grimaced at the taste of blood in his own mouth. Nothing yet. He bit back a groan at his screaming ribs. He'd taken a rather nasty blow to his torso earlier that had sent him flying into the detective. They were both injured rather nicely, with nothing to show for their pain. He saw something moving quickly through the shadows, but brushed it off as a trick of the light. Or possibly a concussion. He eyed the table that held their weapons on the far side of the room. If only we could get our stuff. Shouta blinked. Once, twice. No, he was sure his capture weapon had been there a moment ago. But suddenly, the familiar fabric was missing from the table. His eyes darted around the room as he tried to find who may have taken it. Tsukachi nudged him gently and discreetly gestured for Shouta to look up. There, in the rafters was a small dark figure. They were crouched, and Shouta easily recognized the scarf-like outline of his capture weapon. He prayed that this was another hero that had come to back them up. Before he could do much else, the figure dashed almost too quickly to follow. They threw out his capture weapon with an ease and grace that took Shouta years to achieve. What the? Nobody could use his capture weapon like him. He'd made sure of that when he'd asked the support course to design it while he was still a teenager. But here this stranger was, using it like they'd been training with it for decades. Who the hell are you? One by one, the grunts were quietly hoisted up into the rafters and silenced without drawing attention. It was masterfully done, and Shouta found himself admiring their technique. Hey, Garu, where's the... One of the men stopped and looked around. Hey, where'd everybody? He was quickly cut off as the figure threw down a smoke bomb, alerting the rest of the room to their presence. They then jumped down from the rafters and vanished into the thick haze. Stay still and stay calm. He heard a voice whisper from behind him. Viridian? What are you doing here? Tsukachi whispered back. Shouta jolted. This was Viridian? The most elusive vigilante in Japan was right behind him, and he couldn't do anything. Saving your asses, what does it look like? I told you not to come. Shouta felt the bindings around his hands fall away and the familiar fabric of his capture weapon graze his hand. Judging from the look on the detective's face, the man must have also freed Tsukachi and returned his weapon. You're one crazy vigilante, you know that? Most of you guys would celebrate this situation. Tsukachi hummed as he flicked the safety off of his gun. You don't hear me complaining. Shouta huffed, readying himself for the attack. But how the hell did Viridian learn to use my capture weapon? Shouta wondered to himself. I'm not like most vigilantes. Yeah, we've noticed. Tsukachi smirked as the three of them ran into the dissipating smoke. Shouta was used to fighting with low visibility, and it seemed that Viridian was, too. The two of them managed to take out the remaining men just as the smoke completely vanished. The vigilante, detective, and hero all shared an uneasy and awkward look. I suppose we owe you a thanks. Tsukachi had a sour look on his face as he said it. Shouta realized that this was the first time they'd really gotten a proper look at the vigilante. He was a lot shorter than Shouta thought he'd be. He was decked out in what looked like a ninja costume, complete with a short sword strapped to his back, and had brilliant emerald green eyes that shone like gemstones. He opened his mouth to say something, when the man's bright green eyes widened in fear. He shoved Shouta aside roughly just as a loud bang echoed around the warehouse. Tsukachi reacted quickly, firing off his own shot, killing the leader of the gang who'd shot at them. A wet cough made Shouta's eyes widen as he realized what occurred. Hey! Viridian! He caught the, probably, older man as he staggered. He was bleeding heavily from his chest, where the bullet got him. He took a bullet for me. Shouta realized. That would have killed me. I'll be fine. No, we need to get you to a hospital. Tsukachi quickly balled up some fabric and pressed it against the vigilante's wound. Viridian chuckled. As much as I appreciate the concern, I've dealt with worse before. Besides, it's not as bad as it looks. Before Shouta or Tsukachi could do anything, Viridian roughly shoved them both away. I'll text you guys tomorrow so you know I'm not dead. He winked before escaping out the window faster than either of them could give chase, leaving the two staring dumbfounded after him. They'd never admit just how grateful and relieved they were when Viridian texted them the next morning. Viridian laughed as he leapt across the rooftops like some old-school comic book hero. He'd been leading around his favorite hero and detective duo all night. Again. He'd been a little off his game when he'd started this vigilante work again 7 months ago, but now he was back in full swing, and ready to go. He'd been following any little whisper of the League of Villains. Maybe, if he could find Shigaraki, he could kill the bastard before ever taking the UA exams. Crisis would be averted and the USJ incident wouldn't even happen. Then, they'd just need to worry about All for One, but that was really more of All Might's major problem anyhow. At the very least, All for One wasn't about to bring about the end of humanity as they knew it. At worst he'd forcefully take over Japan as a dictator again. But even that would be better than what he'd already lived through. He smirked as he landed down in an alleyway. This was their reward for all the crap they'd gone through. He knew his little games were beyond annoying, but they entertained him. Besides, at least he was helping them rather than hurting them. His games were usually to protect them, anyhow. Viridian was finally going to let Detective Tsukachi have a face-to-face conversation with him. The warehouse didn't count, because that was more battle banter than an actual conversation. Well, it was also a thank you for worrying about him. After he'd been shot a few weeks ago, he'd proceeded to return home, fix himself up, and pass out. And damn, they'd blown up their group chat while he'd been taking his little power nap. Izuku had been so touched when he'd awoken to 50 worried notifications, and had quickly replied to let them know he was alive and well. Or as well as one can be when they were shot the night before a major exam. Bakugo had been hell to avoid that next day. The two warily stepped into the alleyway. He'd been careful to stay under the radar for the last few weeks, mostly due to his recovering injury. Viridian's note had explicitly told them to show up alone, no other cops. He smirked as he stepped out of the shadows, a tray of coffee cups in his hand. Naomasa. Aizawa. Good to see you two again. He smiled, though they could only see his bright green eyes. The two gave barely noticeable sighs of relief. Glad to see you're alive. How's your injury? Tsukachi asked. It's doing much better now. Thanks for asking. Viridian grinned. Tsukachi nodded to Eraserhead, acknowledging the truth of the statement. Why did you lead us here? Eraserhead asked. I got bored, and thought that, after the games I've put you two through, the least I owed you was a face-to-face conversation. He shrugged, leaning against the brick wall casually. Plus, I figured you were still worried about the whole gunshot thing. He handed over the coffee, to which the hero and detective didn't even blink. Eraserhead quickly started drinking his. You do realize that we have a legal obligation to arrest you, right? Tsukachi asked in disbelief. Yep. But not tonight. I'm simply here to talk for as long as you want, but the moment you make a move to arrest me, I'm gone. So if you've got any burning questions, ask them now. He knew his green eyes were sparkling with amusement, because Eraserhead scowled. Who are you? Eraserhead growled. I am Viridian. Your real name? Something you'll have to figure out on your own. Good luck with that, though. How old are you? Tsukachi asked. Somewhere between the ages of 6 and 50. He smirked. Are you Japanese? Yes. They blinked at the straightforward answer. Born and raised. Why are you a vigilante? Tsukachi asked again. Tough question, detective. He tapped his chin for a moment as he thought. I suppose. I've always wanted to be a hero. But I failed every hero school entrance exam I took as a young teenager. I tried to live a normal, boring life, but... He looked off for a moment. I can't help but want to help people. I just can't not help them. And if I have to do so as a vigilante instead of a hero, then at least I'm still helping others. At least I'm still saving lives. He's telling the truth. Tsukachi blinked incredulously. What, is that uncommon for vigilantes? Viridian tilted his head, confused. Most of the ones I've met just want to use their quirks in public. Tsukachi shook his head. Well, then, Mr. Lie Detector, let me let you in on a little secret. He chuckled again, a grin spreading across his face. I, Viridian, have never used a quirk during my vigilante activities. Why you shitting me? Tell me he's lying. Eraserhead choked. He's telling the truth. Doesn't he that mean? Eraserhead looked like he wanted to bash his head against the brick wall. We can still get you for assault. Tsukachi glared. Section 24 subsection C states that assault charges are valid only when the accused party struck first. I always let my enemies strike first, even if said strike doesn't hit. You can ask any single one of the villains I've turned into you. Then. By the law, I've done nothing illegal. Viridian laughed lowly. Besides, the laws technically don't even affect a quirkless person. Even child custody laws don't matter. That's why Tsunagami-chan's son was put in the foster care system, even though she was alive, able, and had stable income. After her husband died, she was invisible to the law, and her son was taken away. He clenched a fist in anger, making a mental note to keep her husband from dying this go-around, before taking a deep breath. You legally can't arrest me. I'm so fucking done. Eraserhead leaned against the brick wall next to him. Come, now, Eraserhead, don't be like that. And here I've come with an opportunity for you both. The two men stiffened. Opportunity? Yes. Now that we've established that, while I'm a vigilante I'm not technically doing anything illegal, I'd like to extend an offer of alliance with the two of you. Namely, I know a lot of things that go around. I've got an extensive information network. I can provide you with information. Be your eyes and ears beyond the police and hero networks. I'll be your gray area. You realize that we can't actually do that, right? Tsukachi didn't look impressed. Unless under extenuating circumstances. Viridian nodded. But fortunately for me, these are. He tossed a folder at Tsukachi's feet, and the man warily bent down to pick it up. His eyes went wide as he flipped through it. This case has been cold for weeks. I've been looking into it for you. I'm 98% sure that's where they're keeping the missing children. He locked eyes with the two. Look. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm not asking you to like me. But the three of us have one thing in common: we want to save lives. And if I can help you do so, Then why would you throw me away? He shoved his hands in his pocket. You know how to get a hold of me. Think about my offer, and shoot me a text if you want my help on anything. I also gave you my burner phone's number if you feel like dropping me a call, though I usually don't answer those. Just a warning. He glanced at the two. And for your own peace of mind, detective, I have no intentions of hurting you, your men, or any heroes. Eraserhead, I don't mean you, your students if you have any this year, or your co-workers any harm. If anything, I just want to protect everyone I can. What do you want in return? Eraserhead's eyes narrowed. He hesitated for a moment. There's a man I'm after. His name is Shigaraki Tamura. If you find his information, please let me know. He's about as nasty a villain as they come. I don't want him to kill anyone else. You know we can't. Fine. Eraserhead cut off Tsukachi mid-sentence. Eraserhead, what do you mean, fine? If you really mean what you say, and you help us save people, then we'll keep our ears open for any tell of this Shigaraki Tamura person. Thank you. With that, Viridian vanished into the night. Tsukachi Naomasa smiled softly as he reunited the last missing child with their family. Viridian's information had been right on the money, and the vigilante himself had shown up and kept the kids safe until police arrived. He was starting to think that this offer might not be such a bad thing. Unfortunately, it wasn't a call he was allowed to make. You called. Tsuragami stepped into his office, nose likely picking up on Viridian's unfamiliar scent. The dog-headed man kept a steady gaze on his subordinate. Yes, sir. It's about Viridian. Naomasa sighed as he gestured for his boss to close the door behind him. It took an hour and a half to fully explain the situation, along with the new information that the vigilante had never once used his quirk during his nightly activities. The police chief sat for a very long time, thinking over the information that the detective had provided him with. This is quite the conundrum. He hummed. Should we work with him, sir? The information he provided to me is what got those 36 children home safely. Well, it's not like trying to capture him has gotten anyone anywhere. He sighed as he scratched the back of his ear. All right. Any information he shares with you is shared with me. That is your condition. And I would like to meet with him, myself. Naomasa smiled in relief. I'll arrange the meeting. Moldy Brochkli, guys. Viridian's got a web page, now. The Haveno name, yeah, I saw. Apparently, he's getting really popular. Nobody's really seen him aside from the people he's rescued or arrested. Dragonina dress, there are some pics online, now, though. Looks like a ninja. Noiskerdili, I actually found some Viridian merch at my local hero store today. Moldy Brochkli, what? I must have it. Forsaken Emo Boi, isn't he just a vigilante, though? I mean, why would a vigilante have merch? Noiskerdili, no idea. Maybe someone mistook him for a hero? Hold on, I'll send a pic. Noiskerdili. Viridian_merch.jpg Moldy Brochkli, wow. It's his vigilante outfit. Forsaken Emo Boi, how do you know that? It looks just like a Halloween costume to me. Moldy Brochkli, he saved me once, a few months ago. I saw Viridian in action, and it was so cool. Gaye Faname Boi, I saw him, too. Dragonina dress, how do you know he didn't just buy his vigilante outfit from that same costume store? Straight face, Moldy Brochkli. You did. Dragonina dress, and I'm ignored. Cool. Gaye Faname Boi, yeah. I was kidnapped a while back and was held with a bunch of other kids. We really thought we were going to die, but Viridian came by and saved our asses before they could kill us or ship us off somewhere. The police came in just 10 minutes or so later. I think he tipped off the cops, because they sure as hell didn't find us on their own. Either way, I owe Viridian my life. I think my whole family's a Viridian supporter, now. 3 Moldy Brochkli, yes. Our cult is growing. 3 Dragonina dress, cult? Moldy Brochkli, the cult of Viridian, duh. Noiskerdili, Noiskerdili has changed the chat name to Cult of Viridian, Moldy Brochkli, yes. Thank you Noi. Gaye Faname Boi, I'm gonna log out. My bros calling me for dinner. Bye. Kenji scratched his head, blowing the black bangs out of his eyes irritably. Maybe he should spike up his hair? It'd probably look cool. He sighed as he closed out of the chat. Kenji. Dinner. His brother poked his head into his bedroom. Come on, bro. You've been glued to that computer for hours. Aren't you hungry? Sorry. I just wanted to. Looking up stuff about Viridian again. Eijiro grinned easily. He's so manly. I know. Everyone's talking about him, and since there are only about 6 photos and videos of him online, some people have taken to drawing him based off descriptions of his rescues. Kenji bounced in his chair like the excitable 12-year-old he was. He's really getting popular, isn't he? Eijiro tilted his head. Yeah. He's got a fan page, now, too. There's several thousand members, and it's growing by the day. For a guy without a license and no calling card, he's really getting a lot of attention. That's because he helps the people that really need it. Kenji smiled. He's even been seen patrolling Tokyo, Kyoto, Hoso, and Musutafu. I heard a rumor that he patrols the south side of Musutafu, too. You mean the lawless area? Eijiro winced. Man. He's got guts to patrol there. You should have seen him. Kenji became quiet as he remembered. They were going to kill this one kid. They were going to kill me for protecting that girl. But then Viridian appeared out of nowhere and saved me. He missed his brother's flinch at the accidental slip. He shook as he stared down the barrel of the gun. So this was how he was going to die? He was only 12. He didn't have a hardening quirk like his brother. He couldn't stop the bullet that was aimed firmly between his eyes. Kenji heard the gun cock and several of the other kids whimpered. He wouldn't be the first kid killed for stepping out of line, but he really hoped he'd be the last. He closed his eyes as he waited. Bang. Suddenly, he realized that there was no pain. Was death really this painless? You okay, kid? He opened his eyes and saw bright green staring back at him from what looked like a ninja mask. The man held him firmly in his arms, and... You saved me. Yep. The man grinned. Name's Viridian. Don't worry. The police are almost here. It's over, kid. You're going to be just fine. All of you are. Viridian gently set him down on the ground. You're safe. It's over. I'll protect you. For the first time in his life, he felt like he understood why All Might said I am here. When All Might rescued people, he said his catchphrase and you just knew that you would be okay. Viridian's words, I'll protect you, sounded the same, in his ears. It rung with a surety and truth that nearly left him quaking in relief. Because now he knew that nothing would hurt him. He'd be safe. He was safe. And suddenly, as he watched Viridian take down the criminals that had been their captors for the last 2 months, he realized something. All Might was a symbol. A ward against evil and a mantra people chanted to make themselves feel safe. But Viridian was more than that, somehow. He was more concrete. More real. Viridian was his hero. Kenji. Eijiro's gentle voice shook him out of his flashback. Sorry, just remembering the rescue. Viridian was so cool. He smiled softly. No worries, brother. His brother came over and gently pulled him into a hug. I'm just glad you're safe and home. Thanks, Eiji. He smiled into his older brother's shoulder. Eijiro. Kenji. If you boys don't get your butts down here, I'm going to let your father eat all the dessert. Come on, best get down there before Dad eats everything. Eijiro grinned, showing off sharp, shark-like teeth. I hope I meet Viridian again.